When night turns backwards, the town that ages in reverse. At the edge of the map, a town lives in a loop where the sun sets, and its people ungrow. Tonight, we step into the shadows of a place where memories dissolve with the sunrise, and every night rewrites the very fabric of time. Narrator, voiceover, low and measured. Evershade. On paper, it's a dot on an old topographic map, a forgotten settlement that never made the news. On the ground, it's a place where the ordinary laws of biology seem to have been signed away at dusk, and the ticking of every clock runs in reverse. The story begins, as most stories of the uncanny do, with a single, inexplicable observation. In 1973, a traveling salesman named Harold Finch stopped at the town's only diner for a cup of coffee. He noted the peculiar way the town's grandfather clock, perched behind the counter, ticked backward, its hands moving counterclockwise as if trying to undo the day itself. "I thought it was a trick," Finch wrote in his journal, "but the whole town seemed to be unliving." Fast forward to today. A team of investigators, armed with night vision cameras, audio recorders, and a healthy dose of skepticism, arrived at Evershade just before sunset. The sky was a bruised violet, the air thick with the scent of pine sap and something else, something metallic, like old blood. As the sun slipped below the ridge, the town's rhythm changed. First, the streetlights flickered on, not in the usual bright white, but in a soft amber that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the town. Then, the residents emerged from their homes, each one moving with a deliberate slowness that felt both weary and youthful. Children, if they could be called that, clutched worn dolls, their eyes wide, yet their faces bore the faint lines of age. Elderly women, their hair silver, walked with a spring in their step that belied the wrinkles that softened with each passing minute. We spoke with Mara Linton, a lifelong resident, now in her reverse 40s, as she described it. "When the sun goes down, we start to unage," she whispered, eyes darting to the clock tower that loomed over the square. "It's like the world rewinds. Yesterday's pain fades, but the memory of it, it's gone. We wake up with no idea of who we were yesterday." Mara's words were echoed by the town's clockmaker, Elias Vaughan, a man whose hands were as steady as the gears he tended. "The clocks have always run backward here," he said, gesturing to the massive brass mechanism that dominated the town hall. "It started before anyone could remember. The first time we saw it, the whole town fell silent. Then, as the night deepened, we felt lighter. It's as if the weight of time lifts and we become younger, but we also lose the stories that made us who we are. The phenomenon is not limited to the physical. Local folklore tells of a night whisper, a low hum that rises with the darkness, a sound that residents claim pulls the threads of memory away. Our audio equipment captured a faint, resonant vibration at precisely 1947, a frequency that seemed to sync with the backward motion of the town's clocks. When we played it back, the sound was accompanied by a subtle distortion in the video, faces appeared slightly blurred, as if the lens itself was trying to forget. As the night deepened, the town's reverse aging accelerated. By midnight, children who had been toddling at dusk were now crawling, their tiny hands grasping at the air, while the elderly, who had been walking with a spring, now shuffled with the frailty of old age. Yet, with each regression, the streets grew quieter. Conversations that began with laughter at sunset dwindled into murmurs, then into silence. The most unsettling moment came at 2:13, when the town's central clock struck 12, backward. The chime resonated, not forward, but in a descending echo that seemed to pull the very air toward the ground. At that instant, a figure emerged from the shadows of the clock tower, a silhouette that moved against the flow of the reverse tide. It was a man, his features indistinct, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the street lamps. He stood still, staring directly at the camera, his gaze unblinking. We tried to approach, but the ground beneath us felt soft, as if the earth itself was yielding. The air grew colder, and the night whisper rose to a crescendo, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through our bones. The man raised a hand, and the backward-running clock's hands jerked, stuttering for a fraction of a second before resuming their relentless reverse motion. In that frozen instant, the town's lights flickered, the shadows danced, and a distant scream, barely audible, cut through the hum. The camera's feed glitched, the image warping into static, then clearing to reveal the town square empty, the clock tower looming like a sentinel over a place where time itself had turned its back. Narrator. What does this figure represent? Is it a guardian of the reverse, a prisoner of the night, or something far older than the town itself? And why does the night erase yesterday's memories, leaving only the present to unravel? The investigation pauses here, at the edge of a mystery that refuses to be solved by sunrise. The next chapter will follow the team as they delve deeper into the heart of Evershade, seeking answers that may lie not just in the clocks, but in the very fabric of reality that unravels when the sun goes down. The night fell over Evershade like a curtain drawn in reverse, each gust of wind seeming to pull the darkness back toward the horizon. Mara adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, feeling the weight of the notebook inside shift as if the pages themselves were reluctant to be opened. Beside her, Professor Lumen's spectacles caught the faint glint of a street lamp that, contrary to all expectation, dimmed rather than brightened as the hour approached midnight. "Remember," Lumen whispered, his voice a low hum that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than the cobblestones, "the clocks here are not merely broken. They are, aligned." He tapped the side of his notebook, where a sketch of a gear mechanism spiraled outward, its teeth pointing inward, a visual paradox that made Mara's eyes flicker with unease. They moved as a unit, the three of them, Mara, Lumen, and the local archivist, a wiry woman named Celine who had offered to guide them through the labyrinthine alleys, each step measured against the ticking of the town's central clock tower. The tower loomed ahead, its massive bronze face turned away from the sky, its hands moving counterclockwise in a slow, deliberate crawl. As they approached, the sound of its gears grinding against each other grew louder, a metallic sigh that seemed to pull the very air into a vortex. "Listen," Selma said, her breath forming a thin veil in the cold night. "When the tower strikes 12, it doesn't announce the hour. It erases it." She gestured toward the iron doors at the base of the tower, their hinges rusted but still turning with a smoothness that defied the decay surrounding them. Mara's pulse quickened. She had seen the townsfolk's faces earlier that day, eyes glazed, smiles fixed in a perpetual loop of anticipation that never arrived. Their lives were a choreography of waiting for a moment that never came, and now she stood on the precipice of that very moment. The trio slipped through the doors, the interior of the tower swallowing them in a darkness that seemed to swallow sound as well. The air inside was cool, scented with oil and something metallic that reminded Mara of blood. The walls were lined with gears of varying sizes, each one turning in the opposite direction of the one above it, a cascade of reverse motion that created a hypnotic rhythm. "Look," Lumen said, pointing to a brass panel etched with symbols that resembled constellations, but the stars were arranged in a pattern that made no sense to any known sky. "These are not just clocks. They're chronometers for something else." Selma stepped forward, her fingers brushing the surface of the panel. The moment her skin made contact, a low hum resonated through the tower, and the gears seemed to accelerate, their teeth interlocking with a precision that felt almost alive. A faint glow began to emanate from the center of the panel, casting elongated shadows that stretched toward the ceiling. Mara felt a tug at the back of her mind, as if a thread of memory she didn't possess was being pulled into view. Images flickered, an ancient market square, a river that flowed uphill, a child laughing as a clock's hands spun backward, the sound of a bell tolling in reverse. The sensations were disorienting, but they coalesced into a single, undeniable truth: the town's backward time was a symptom, not the cause. A sudden, sharp clang reverberated through the tower, and the glow from the panel flared brighter, illuminating a hidden doorway that had been concealed behind a wall of gears. The doorway was framed by an arch of polished obsidian, its surface reflecting the swirling lights of the tower like a dark mirror. Beyond it, a narrow staircase spiraled downwards, disappearing into a void that seemed to swallow the very notion of up and down. "Do we go down?" Selma asked, her voice barely audible over the grinding of the gears. Her eyes, however, shone with a fierce curiosity that matched Mara's own. Lumen hesitated, his mind racing through equations and theories. If the clocks are a feedback loop, then this could be the source. The origin point of the reversal. He glanced at the panel, now pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beat of his own heart. Or it could be a trap. We have no way of knowing what lies beneath without risking everything. Mara stepped forward, feeling the weight of the notebook in her satchel as if it were a talisman. "We've come this far," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We can't turn back now. Not when we're so close." She placed her hand on the obsidian arch, and the surface rippled under her touch, like water disturbed by a stone. The doorway opened with a sigh, revealing a stairwell that seemed to descend into a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but a thick, palpable void that pressed against her skin. The air grew colder, and a faint, metallic scent intensified, mingling with the smell of old paper and ink. As they began their descent, the gears above them slowed, their motion becoming more deliberate, as if the tower itself were holding its breath. The sound of the clock's hands moving backward grew louder, a deep, resonant ticking that seemed to echo from the very core of the earth. Each tick was a reminder that time here was not linear, but a loop that could be broken, or perhaps, a rope being pulled taut. Halfway down, the staircase opened into a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with shelves that held objects that defied categorization, hourglasses filled with black sand, watches whose faces displayed dates that had not yet occurred, and a massive, ornate mirror that reflected not the room but a sky of swirling constellations that shifted with each breath. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, upon which rested a single, massive clock, its face blank, its hands absent, its interior a swirling vortex of gears and cogs that seemed to spin in every direction at once. The vortex emitted a low, humming tone that resonated with the ticking from above, creating a dissonant symphony that made Mara's teeth ache. Selma stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the clock. This is the heart," she whispered. "The source of the reversal." Lumen approached the pedestal, his hand hovering over the vortex. As his fingers brushed the edge, the humming intensified, and the vortex began to draw in the surrounding air, pulling at the edges of the chamber. The shelves trembled, and the objects on them began to levitate, spinning slowly as if caught in an invisible current. Mara felt a sudden pressure in her chest, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched. The ticking from the tower above grew louder, now a deafening roar that seemed to reverberate through her bones. The vortex's surface rippled, and a faint silhouette emerged from its depths, a figure cloaked in shadows, its face obscured, but its eyes glinting with an ancient, knowing light. The figure raised a hand, and the vortex surged, sending a wave of cold, metallic wind through the chamber. The shelves cracked, the objects fell, and the mirror shattered, its shards scattering across the floor like a constellation of broken stars. The humming turned into a scream, a sound that seemed to tear at the edges of time itself. Mara's heart pounded as she realized the figure was not merely a presence but a conduit, something that could manipulate the flow of time, pulling it backward or forward at will. The figure's hand pointed directly at her, and a cold, electric shock ran through her veins, as if the very notion of her existence was being rewired. "Don't," Selma began, but her voice was cut off by a sudden, deafening clang that reverberated through the chamber, shaking the very foundation of the tower above. The gears above ground stuttered, then halted, as if the entire town held its breath. In that suspended moment, the vortex swelled, its surface rippling like a pond struck by a stone, and the figure's eyes flared with a blinding light. Mara felt herself being pulled toward the vortex, the force of it like a tide dragging her into an abyss that promised both revelation and annihilation. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the vortex just as a hand, Lumen's, grasped her wrist, his grip firm and desperate. The world around them seemed to tilt, the ticking now a frantic rush, the gears grinding in a frantic, chaotic dance. "Hold on!" Lumen shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar. "We can't let it." A sudden, sharp crack split the air, and the vortex erupted in a flash of blinding light, throwing them all backward. The chamber fell into darkness, the humming ceased, and the ticking stopped as if a great clock had been silenced forever. Mara lay on the cold stone floor, her breath ragged, the taste of iron on her tongue. The vortex was gone, the figure vanished, and the pedestal was empty, except for a single, silver key that lay glinting in the dim light that filtered through a crack in the ceiling. The key was ornate, its teeth shaped like tiny hourglasses, each one filled with a different color of sand. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, as Selma's voice whispered from the shadows, "We've only just begun to understand what lies beneath the clocks." The key, it could open doors we never imagined. Before Mara could answer, a low, resonant chime echoed from somewhere deep within the tower, a sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the town itself, a sound that was both a warning and a summons. The air grew heavy, and the darkness beyond the cracked ceiling seemed to pulse, as if something vast and unseen was stirring, waiting for the moment when the key would turn. Mara's hand hovered over the key, the moment stretching thin as a thread, the future hanging in the balance. The chime grew louder, reverberating through the stone, through their bones, and as the sound reached its climax, a sudden, blinding flash illuminated the chamber, revealing a silhouette at the far end, a figure cloaked in the same shadows as the one that had emerged from the vortex, its eyes now fixed directly on Mara, its mouth opening in a silent, impossible scream. The scream was a sound that had no voice. It stretched across the periphery of perception, a pressure that pressed against their eardrums like a hand squeezing a balloon. Mara felt the vibration in the marrow of her fingers, a cold that seeped upward from the soles of her boots to the crown of her head. The figure at the far wall did not move, yet the air around it seemed to ripple, as if the darkness it wore was a liquid being pulled into some unseen vortex. Eli's hand tightened around the hilt of his antiquated pistol, the worn wood creaking under the strain of his grip. The instrument, an heirloom from the town's former watchmaker, had never been designed for combat, yet here it seemed the only thing that could spring into action at a moment's notice. He edged forward, his boots soft on the stone, eyes flicking between Mara's face and the cloaked silhouette. The chamber itself, an ancient vault carved beneath the clock tower's foundation, responded to the presence of the unseen. The great gears embedded in its far walls, remnants of a time when the town measured its days by the grinding of massive iron teeth, began to turn in reverse, each click a guttural echo that sounded like the sigh of a dying beast. Their motion was slow, deliberate, as if the very mechanism of time itself were being rewound. Mara raised her arm, her palm open, and a thin filament of light spilled from the amulet that had become her compass ever since she first set foot in the town. The crystal pulsed, a deep violet that resonated with the hum of the gears. When the light struck the cloaked figure, it seemed to dissolve the shadows like mist in sunrise, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. The eyes were twin pools of obsidian, depthless, reflecting the entire chamber and everything that existed in its farthest corners. Within those pits, Mara caught fleeting glimpses, a child's laughter, a market square bustling with people who never seemed to age, a storm that raged backward, rain climbing up from the gutters into the sky. She tried to speak, but the words were swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed the scream. The air grew denser, each breath a labor, as if the vault itself were inhaling, waiting for something to happen. "Who are you?" Eli demanded, his voice a hoarse rasp. He took a step, the pistol now a blur of movement, aimed at the heart of the shadow. The figure did not answer. Instead, the cloak seemed to unspool from its shoulders, each strand a thin ribbon of night that unrolled across the stone floor, forming a pathway that led toward the outer ring of the chamber. As the ribbons spread, they illuminated a series of ancient runes etched into the walls, sigils of a language no longer spoken in any corner of the living world. The symbols glowed a faint amber, their light pulsing in time with the backward-turning gears. Mara recognized one of them, a simple curve that had marked the entrance to every well in the town's oldest district. The others, however, were more complex, spirals that intertwined with arrowheads pointing toward a central point now revealed to be a recessed alcove in the far wall. Within that alcove sat a solitary object, a brass pocket watch, its cover cracked, the hands frozen at 12 o'clock, but the face was not a conventional one. Instead of numerals, it bore a map of the town itself, each street rendered as a thin line of silver, each building a tiny glyph that seemed to shift when not directly observed. Mara stepped forward, drawn by a compulsion she could not fully understand. The moment her boot brushed the stone, the ribbons of shadow recoiled, snapping back like a cat's tail. The runes flared brighter, casting jagged shadows that danced across her face. The amulet's light flickered, then steadied, as if drawing strength from the chaos around it. "Stop!" Eli shouted, lunging again. His pistol discharged, a crack echoing through the vaulted chamber, the sound reverberating off the stone in a series of diminishing whirls. The bullet struck the pocket watch, shattering the glass cover in a cascade of silver shards that rained down like tiny stars. For an instant, everything seemed to pause, the gears ceased their reverse motion, the vortex of darkness stilled, and the scream, which had never truly left Mara's mind, faded into a low hum. The moment the gunfire ceased, the cloaked figure's eyes flared a sudden, blinding white. The darkness that formed its body erupted, spiraling outward in a vortex that swallowed the broken watch, the shards, even the reflected light from the amulet. The vortex expanded, its edge a razor-thin line that flickered between existence and void, and it began to pull at everything in the chamber with an insatiable hunger. Mara felt the amulet tugging at her chest, as if the crystal were a magnetic pull trying to keep her tethered to the world that was rapidly unspooling. She could hear Eli gasping, his fingers clawing at his throat as the vortex brushed his skin, leaving a cold that seemed to seep into his soul. The gears, now silent, stood still, frozen in a paradox of motion and stillness. A low, guttural chant rose from the stone itself, a chorus of voices that were not quite human, not quite animal, a choir of the forgotten. The chant seemed to come from the very foundation of the town, from the roots of the ancient oak that anchored the clock tower's shadow to the earth. As the sound swelled, the walls of the vault trembled, and a fissure appeared along the topmost stone, a thin line of light seeping through, offering a glimpse of something beyond, an endless sky where stars marched backward across the horizon, each step a reversal of time itself. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could see the path the vortex was carving, a spiraling tunnel toward the fissure, a direct line to whatever lay beyond the reverse sky. In that instant, she understood that whatever this entity was, it was not merely a guardian of the town's secret, but a conduit, a bridge between the world that moved forward and a realm that refused to age. The cloaked figure raised an arm, fingers splayed, and from its palm poured a torrent of darkness that slithered like ink, racing toward the fissure. The darkness collided with the light, and for a heartbeat the two forces seemed to cancel each other out, creating a momentary stillness that felt like the breath of the universe held in suspense. Then, without warning, the vortex surged forward, a wave of blackness that slapped the stone walls, sending debris scattering. The amulet in Mara's chest pulsed violently, and the faint violet glow burst into a blinding white flare that illuminated every fissure, every crack, every hidden corner of the chamber. The sound of gears grinding backwards resumed, faster now, a frantic chorus that seemed to echo the frantic beating of Mara's own heart. She saw Eli stumble, his pistol falling from his grasp, clattering against the stone and reverberating with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through time itself. He reached out, his fingers brushing Mara's sleeve, but the vortex's pull was stronger. The cloaked figure's scream, still silent, widened into a wave, each invisible note rippling through Mara's mind, threatening to dissolve her thoughts into pure oblivion. Mara knew she had only seconds to act. The amulet's light dimmed, the crystal flickering like a candle caught in a gale. The air grew heavy with the scent of rust and old paper, the ghost of 1,000 forgotten seconds. Somewhere behind her, the pocket watch lay broken, its cracked face reflecting the chaotic swirl of shadows and light. She made a decision, driven by a mixture of desperation and a mysterious resolve that seemed to come from the very streets of the town, from the echo of bells that rang backward in the distance. She lunged forward, aiming for the vortex's mouth, her fingers clawing at the black tide, hoping to grasp at something, anything, that could halt its inexorable pull. Just as she reached the edge, the vortex contracted, the darkness coiling like a serpent ready to strike. In that instant, a single note, clear, pure, and terrifyingly familiar, cut through the cacophony, resonating deep within the stone. It was the chime of the town's central clock, but it rang in reverse, 12, 11, 10. The world seemed to tilt, the reverse beats of the clock pulling at the very fabric of Mara's reality. The stone floor beneath her trembled, cracks spidering outward as if the vault itself were about to split in two. And in the split second before the ground gave way, Mara caught sight of a pair of eyes, human, terrified, and achingly familiar, staring back at her from the darkness beyond the vortex. A cold hand brushed the back of her neck, and she turned, breath caught in her throat, as the silhouette she had feared all along stepped forward, its form indistinguishable from the surrounding void, yet its presence undeniable. The figure's mouth opened once more, this time not in a scream, but in a word that seemed to echo across ages and spaces, a single syllable that vibrated through stone, through bone, through the very notion of time itself. Mara's mind raced to catch the syllable, to understand its meaning, even as the ground beneath her cracked open, a fissure widening rapidly toward the endless, backward-marching sky. The vortex swelled, the dark tide poised to consume everything, and the sound of the reverse chimes grew louder, each toll a countdown to an unknown climax. She stood at the precipice, the amulet's faint glow now the only thing separating her from total darkness, her hand inches from the yawning chasm, the mysterious figure's eyes never leaving hers. In that instant, a single, impossible thought pierced through the dread, perhaps the answer lay not in fighting the vortex, but in stepping into it. The vault trembled once more, a deafening roar rising from the gears, the walls fracturing, the light from the fissure flaring brighter than any fire she had ever seen. And then, the stone beneath Mara's left foot shifted, a sudden give as the floor cracked, sending a shudder through the entire chamber. Her balance faltered, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to stop, the reverse clock ticks pausing mid-beat. The vortex surged forward with renewed ferocity, as if sensing her hesitation, and the cloaked figure's mouth opened again, this time revealing a gleam, a glint of something metallic, something sharp, just as a cold breath brushed Mara's cheek, whispering a name she could not yet place. Her heart hammered, her breath caught, and as the world tilted once more, the choir of unseen voices rose to a crescendo, each note a promise of either salvation or oblivion. And then, a sudden, crushing weight slammed into Mara's chest, and the amulet flickered out. The darkness surged, filling every crevice, every heartbeat, every breath, as the stone walls of the vault began to close in, promising an end that felt both inevitable and terrifyingly premature. She gasped, ears ringing with the final chime as the clock struck what could only be. The chapter halts, the air thick with anticipation. The wind that had whispered through the crooked alleys of Larkspur Hollow the night before now roared, dragging the shutters of the old stone houses into a frantic dance. As the town's towers ticked in reverse, the street lamps flickered on again, casting long, thin shadows that retreated toward their sources instead of stretching outward. I stood at the center of the square, my breath a thin rope of frost that dissolved back into the night before it could even leave my lips. The bronze plaque on the central pedestal, the one that had once declared, "Welcome to Larkspur Hollow, where time finds its way," was now illegible, its letters slowly unetching themselves, as if the town itself were unwriting its history. Behind me, the clock tower's massive hands clawed upward, each tick a guttural inhale that seemed to suck the seconds from the air. I could hear, faintly, the murmurs of the townsfolk, their voices rendered backward, each syllable unspooling into a strange, discordant lullaby. Children's laughter curled back into the mouths that birthed it, and the baker's shouted orders retreated into a soft, resigned sigh. The market stalls that had been emptied in the morning were now refilling themselves, loaves of bread cracking and unbaking, vegetables rejoining the earth within the roots of the stalls. I forced my eyes toward the old chapel at the far end of the square, its stained-glass windows shimmering like veins of liquid night. The doors, which had been sealed shut behind me earlier, now swung open of their own accord, the hinges creaking in reverse, as if the very would mourn being unridden. A thin column of pale light spilled onto the cobblestones, growing thinner with each breath I dared to take. Inside, the altar lay empty, its candles unlighting, wax crawling back into the spindles, reforming the slain wicks. A single parchment fluttered on the pew, its ink running back into the quill that had never been raised, the words unforming into a half-spoken prayer that never reached any ear. The town's mayor, a gaunt figure with eyes like polished onyx, approached me, his steps reverberating in a rhythm that felt both familiar and alien. "You have returned," he said, his voice a reverse echo of a promise never kept. We have been waiting for you to unmake what we could never finish. He held out a silver pocket watch, its glass face cracked in a pattern that mirrored the cracked sky above. The hand spun backward at an impossible speed, each click a deafening exhale that seemed to strip the world of its forward momentum. The clocks were never meant to run backward for the sake of novelty, he whispered, but as a safeguard. A barrier against a tide that does not forgive. He told me of the night the river ran north, of a darkness that seeped from the valley beyond, a void that devoured futures as easily as a child devours sugar. In a desperate bid, the founders of Larkspur Hollow had turned their clocks backward, hoping to trap that darkness in a loop, as a moth caught in a spider's web. The clocks, they believed, would draw the void into a past it could not escape, sealing it forever. But each reversal only made the void more patient, more cunning, learning to slip through the cracks that backtime left behind. I felt the ground beneath my boots shift, the cobblestones turning into loose sand, the square dissolving like a watercolor left in the rain. The townspeople began to rise from the shadows, their faces a pale smear of what had been and what could no longer be. Their eyes were empty wells, reflecting not my own face but a dark void that pulsed in the distance, a heartbeat that seemed to sync with the reversed ticking of the clocks. The mayor stepped back, his form blurring, becoming a smear of ink on parchment, then a whisper of smoke that curled into the night. In that instant, every moment I had lived in Larkspur Hollow unspooled in reverse, stripping away the layers of my memories until only the raw, primal fear remained. I tried to run, but the path folded onto itself, leading me back to the square's center, where the pedestal now bore a single word, etched in a script that seemed to come from the darkness itself: stay. A cold hand, not my own, brushed the back of my neck, and I felt the weight of centuries press down, as if the town itself were an ancient organism, breathing through its clocks, inhaling my existence and exhaling emptiness. The last tick of the tower's hand echoed in my mind, a sound that was both a beginning and an ending. The clocks had run backward long enough, perhaps forever, yet the void still lingered, patient as a cat watching its prey. As the darkness gathered at the edges of my vision, a single thought crystallized, sharp as a blade: what if the true purpose of the clocks was not to trap the void, but to invite it, to reverse time until the present itself ceases to exist, and the only thing that remains is the ticking of a heart that never beats? And then, just before the world dissolved into a blackness that hummed with the sound of unwinding gears, I heard a voice, my own, yet not, murmuring from the depths of the night: will the clocks ever stop turning, or is the town doomed to unright itself forever, complete?